Chapter 16. The Making of an Institutionalized Child. After rebooting, the mentorship project returned in 2014 as a gentler, more patient version of its first avatar. Fresh from the baptism by fire, Kamal and I were now decidedly more confident but still raw from the experience. We were not sure that we could transmit our acquired learning to the new mentors, and without those insights, it would be impossible to be an effective mentor for this project. So, the two of us took on responsibility of the entire project instead of recruiting any more mentors. Over time, as the project progressed, the first successes became visible and I began to find answers to the questions I had asked all those years ago. I had been witness to a childhood within children's homes. Now watching them as functioning adults gave me a more complete understanding into the making of an institutionalized child. Alone. One word to describe the conundrum of an institutionalized child. Alone. One word to describe the conundrum of an institutionalized childhood. The emotional lacuna, the academic gaps, poor decision making, predisposition to addiction, everything boiled down to a singular cause. At every stage, in every action, in each decision, at every repercussion, within their houses, inside the institutions, out in the world, at all times, in every place, alone. That is the essence of their lives. Lonely beginnings. Sendil and I have a long association going back to 2006. We both showed up at Sneha Children's Home at the same time, and I was his first teacher ever, in his first classroom ever. I watched him grow from a child into an adult, and through the mentorship project, I managed to keep in touch with him even after he left Sneha Children's Home at 18. It took 8 years for Sendil to tell me his story, as much as he could remember. His first memories are just faint flashes of life on the streets. His memory of his mother is confined to warmth and smell of her body as they huddled together in bus stops and street corners. Then, all too soon, that comfort was gone and he was alone. He continued to live on the streets, but now it was always cold. He does not recollect what happened to his mother, but somehow he is certain that she was mentally ill. Years later, when he tracked down the remnants of his family, they confirmed this. I was always ill, he recollects. I was always coughing and sneezing and shivering. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get warm. He then ended up at a construction site where the building contractor gave him food and shelter in return for labor. Work was hard, and after dark, there were the drunken beatings to deal with. Eventually, Senthil ran away from the site and boarded a train which brought him to Sneha Children's Home via the railway police. Senthil came to the street shelter when he was 10 years old. At 10, he had seen loss and abuse, done hard labor, and had encounters with the police. Just as long as a list of things he had never seen: home, family, physical security, school. Through a long journey, he was alone and cold. A word he never fails to mention when he talks about his early childhood. Whether it is Senthil sheltering under a flyover on rainy nights, Reza sneaking into trains to escape an abusive father, Abe locked within his trauma, or Ajay coping with his losses, every one of them is a narrative of lone battles, lost childhood, and a lesson in being alone. Aloneness is a truth and an essential learning for a complete life and healthy relationships. For an adult in charge of his life and decisions, this awareness can be a spur to self-reliance and achievement. For a child devoid of decision-making powers and under the guardianship of incompetent or deviant adults, this awareness can only lead to utter despair. Knowledge that is a liberating force in adulthood is a source of despair if I learn too early and too well. No child should have this awareness because ever after, even after the darkness has passed by, the habit of aloneness persists. It is a lesson that can never be unlearned. It casts a long shadow on happy times, on close relationships, on the general outlook to life. When this early deficit is followed by institutionalization, the wounds are carried forward into the new system. Institutionalization is not a process that ministers to individual needs, and instead of healing, the aloneness is reinforced within the shelters. With the habits of aloneness persisting and with no opportunities to build up emotional or social skills, social integration can thereafter become a daunting task. Alone in the institution. A family is a sanctuary, a commitment, a promise that says, there may be a seething mass of humanity out there, but to me, you are the only one. I will never cook beetroot in this house because I know you loathe it, or use ginger because you are allergic to it. I will always remember that your favorite color is blue and that you love rose-scented soaps. I promise to feel and acknowledge your sadness when you are distressed and brag about your achievements real and imagined. I will overlook your irrational outbursts and indulge your foibles. I will pussyfoot around you because you are the sensitive kind and cajole you into overcoming your fear of the stage. I will intervene when you are being bullied at school and react when you fall in love with your classmate. I will provide you with an ear and a heart when you need it and when you don't. Families provide for good things which cannot be replicated or measured because of their intangible nature. A hug, a kiss, a smile, a touch, a lullaby, a story, a conversation, laughter, gossip. It is impossible to figure how these pieces fit into complete the puzzle. It is only when the systems it is only when the system breaks down that we grasp the importance of these ethereal little things. As of now, the shelter homes for children are no more than a storage space for children who have fallen through the cracks in traditional familial structures. They are yanked out of the social fabric, kept apart from the world at large, and then years later drop back in with the expectation that they will carry on their disrupted journey. But that is a bizarre expectation because upon institutionalization, these children lose more than a home and a family. They lose all social spaces required for conventional childhood rituals of work and play. Games with neighborhood children, visits to relatives, going to the park, running errands for parents, shopping for occasions, religious celebrations. They lose an individualized childhood, replaced as it is with a process driven upbringing. Munna is a classic case of a child who would have thrived in a setting that rewarded individualism. His quirks would have been cherished, his intelligence nourished, his attention-seeking satiated. In case of Munna, his intense individualism just made the damage visible and obvious. But all the children housed at an institution suffer from being alone, from having no personal guardians, from having to resolve every issue on their own, from never being able to articulate their feelings, from having to heal themselves without a strong support system. Under the circumstances, critical issues remain unresolved, multiply manifold, and return to haunt them in the future. Roshan, now 20 years old, is reaping what was sown a decade ago. He is terrified of math, and the unresolved childhood issue has now brought his career to a grinding halt. He joined Sneha Children's Home at 10. And that was really when his schooling began. Despite his late introduction to academics, he managed to catch up with children his own age, except for math. He never got a firm grip on the basic concepts of multiplication and division. An academic gap which passed by unheeded on the back of the automatic promotion policy of the government. With passing years, the tottering foundations laid waste all his attempts to come to grips with the subject, and eventually his bewilderment turned to pathological hatred for math. It was different for my classmates who had families, says Roshan. My teachers would tell their parents the problems in detail, and most of them would get extra tutoring when they had academic problems. Since I was from a government home, the teachers knew that I would get no individual help, and they didn't really bother with the details in my case. At the shelter, except for those who were really miserable at academics, the rest of us were expected to cope the best we could. At study time, I would sit for hours trying to figure out math, but it didn't work. After passing grade 10, he heaved a sigh of relief at leaving behind his struggle with math. He joined a polytechnic for a plumbing course, and all was well till his second year, when he was faced with a paper in workshop calculation. In the last 2 years, he has failed all 4 attempts to clear that exam, with each failure only aggravating his math paranoia. A simple childhood issue which could have been spotted and resolved under more individual supervision has taken on unwieldy proportions 10 years on. This is a recurring theme at Sneha's Children's Home. Little academic niggles left unattended because unless it is humongous, it is not really noticeworthy. Every parent knows of the constant vigilance to ensure that no academic gap is left unattended, and the tremendous amount of time and resources required to make a child academically competent. Lack of time, resources, manpower, and above all, the high levels of self-reliance and responsibility expected from the children within government homes leave no room for this kind of due diligence for every single child. Few children manage to fulfill their academic potential under the circumstances. At 18, they exit the institution with inadequate academic skills to pursue higher education and are ill-equipped to compete in the job market. As to their emotional well-being, this was what my teen student told me when I refused to bring a horror movie. for screening at the shelter home. I have slept alone in a railway station for a week. I have seen the inside of a jail. And you still think a movie can scare me? He was dismissive of his experiences, as are most of the other children. With no processes in place for the long drawn out healing process, they have learned to put a lid on it and move on. As with everything else in their lives, they have learned to cope with this too. Becoming tough has brought a semblance of normalcy to their lives, but stunted their emotional growth. Even with the best of intentions, a shelter home remains a piece of infrastructure where the child can be no more than a cog in the eternally turning wheel. It is an establishment where everyone has an allotted place at the dining table. It is not a home where the menu revolves around personal whims. In this mass-produced childhood, there can be no concession made for the temper tantrum of a child having a bad day or the sullen behavior of a sensitive child. The child has no personal guardian to shield him or preserve his individual quirks, to comprehend the shades of his emotions or read the nuances of his body language. In an institutionalized childhood, the only way to get attention or time of the caregivers is to snatch it aggressively. And as befits a cog in the wheel, the exit of the child leaves no void and wrings no tears, and the empty place at the dining table is filled in by the next in line. Typically, this system churns out cripplingly shy children with low self-esteem, irrespective of their intellect or talent. This puts them in a precarious situation when it comes to mainstreaming their lives. Emotional scars and social ineptitude drown out their potential, leaving most of them as permanent outsiders. Having been edged out of the social mainstream by being placed in a sheltered home, the chances are that they will never be able to make their way in again. The odds are just too heavily stacked against them. Alone in childhood often means alone forever. Alone outside. Out in the world, this is the juncture at which all that is unlearned, unhealed, and unresolved within the institution comes together to unravel their lives. For institutionalized children, their induction into adulthood is a bucket of ice cold reality dunked over their heads. At 18, they are no longer eligible for government financial aid. In stable families, nobody expects their 18-year-old children to be independent in any real sense, and turning 18 is an excuse for families to party, and maybe time to get the driving license. For institutionalized children, 18 is the age at which the music stops. Ready or not, out into the world they go where, as always, they cope with everything the best they can, all by themselves. Isolated as they are from the society at large, all through their growing up years. These children are unskilled at navigating the social framework or keeping an emotional equilibrium, putting them at high risk for continued social isolation. Their chances of social integration are low since they lack the basic social skills of communication, negotiation, and conflict resolution. Also, missing is the ability to recognize or express emotional nuances and vulnerabilities, leaving them struggling with social interactions and relationships. They draw from the painful past experiences of being reluctant participants in unequal encounters. Within homes, families, schools, and shelter homes, they have survived conflicts with oversized opponents with one simple strategy: duck or disappear. It is a learned behavior that is hardwired into their system, and by now it is an instinct that kicks in at the first sign of trouble. Once we had our heads wrapped around this, it was easy to decode the strange behavior of our mentees. When we got too forceful with our agenda, they scooted, ergo the interviews and the jobs. The alternative was to put forth an opposing view, and that was something they were supremely incompetent at. They had simply never had enough opportunities to do so in life. Disagreements being extremely hazardous to life within unstable families and in shelter homes. The same thing happened at work. They vanished at the slightest provocation: an argument with a colleague, a change in company policy, inconvenient shift timings, a reprimand from the supervisor, inability to understand instructions. The last one was a bizarre reminder of how deep-rooted and the last one was a bizarre reminder of how deep-rooted and serious the problem was. My boss gave me instructions in English and I didn't understand anything he said. So I turned and walked out of the office and never returned. It was a job that lasted exactly an hour, and the boss is probably still scratching his head, wondering exactly what happened. Weird from my standpoint, pragmatic from his. Both of us have arrived at the juncture from opposing directions. He has come from a world of scarcity and I from a world of surfeit. At the workplace, this behavior is interpreted as a sign of as a sign of unreliability, but the reality is that it is simply a matter of dysfunctional social skills, a deficit that creates havoc in their lives. While still teenagers, institutionalized children are pushed into taking major life decisions and charting their own future on an unknown terrain with little experience in decision making and no support systems in place. Little surprised then that their decisions are often random acts with no thought to long term consequences and certainly no long term planning. One false step leads to another, and soon their life starts spinning out of control. In the case of Sharad, his life began to derail while he was just 17. All that it took was a bad report. All that it took was a bad report card and a tempered tantrum. Sharad was an excellent student till grade 10. He took up science in grade 11 but found math and chemistry too difficult to handle. He plugged in both subjects that year and the next. Consequently, an argument with the children's home administration took a wrong turn and heated words were exchanged. In anger, he felt in anger, he left the institution, dropped out, and began doing menial jobs. He has worked as a shop assistant, waiter, mason, house painter, any random job available at that point. Presently, he works at a salon and stays in a small room with the other workers of the salon. All of them much older than him. Every evening after work, they drink late into the night, and Sharath has been in trouble a couple of times for reporting to work drunk. The last bit of information was worrying, but not surprising. At the beginning of the mentorship project, Kamal and I would have been shocked, appalled, and disheartened to find our 18-year mentee involved with substance abuse. But over time, we have become more concerned with circumstances that predispose them to addictions. Alcohol and drugs have played a central part in most of their stories. They have lived in areas overflowing with alcohol, watched alcoholism within the family, had friends who dealt in drugs, and finally had no role models who practiced moderation. Substance abuse has always been such a routine part of their lives, and the shock value of addiction has been blunted to such an extent that they slip into it almost as a matter of course. Alcoholism and drug addiction is a part of the huge baggage of learned behavior they carry with them. At 18, Sharath has left academics far behind. In fact, it has been a year since he even touched his books. He doesn't even broach the topic anymore. And at our last mentorship project meeting, We made little headway in any direction. I can't study anymore, he said flatly. I lost my grade 10 mark sheet. How? When I changed my residence, I forgot to take the file with the documents. So, what do you plan to do? Sharath suppressed a yawn. He was getting bored with the line of questioning. I am planning to do a course in haircutting. What about further studies? You don't want to complete grade 12? Getting another grade 10 mark sheet is not a problem. We can apply for a duplicate. Okay, I will do that, Sharath says disinterestedly. Our enthusiasm was in sharp contrast to Sharath's nonchalance. He was beginning to fidget noticeably, and I knew that we had reached the end of that conversation. He looked so vulnerable and childlike, with his soft face and small frame. He could easily pass off as a 14-year-old, but for the reek of tobacco around him. We made some small talk, and he promised us a free haircut if we came to his salon. We fixed the date for the next meeting and took a selfie with him before leaving. With the wisdom of hindsight, Sharath's life is clearly a narrative of missed opportunities. His life might have been on track if he had extra tutoring before he failed. Extra tutoring after he failed if there had been a mediator to resolve his dispute with the institution authorities. If he had been persuaded not to drop out of school, if he had been buffeted when he left the institution. Apart from lamenting over the intervention opportunities that had slipped by, the big learning for the mentorship project was the necessity to move in and keep and keep a closer watch on our mentors so as not to be caught unawares again, and to focus on studying our mentees before they took too many wrong turns, because missing the sparks almost always meant having to fight a ragging bushfire thereafter.